So we spent some time yesterday afternoon, last night, getting the draft SRB report together, and Olaf was kind enough to do it on his computer because mine won't share. So he passed it on to Dave, and Dave has since updated, cleaned it all up. So we have that.
And does
We
that
can
version
go.
include Sven's comments that he sent last night or this morning? I wasn't
Dave?
sure if those made it in.
Okay. Okay. Did those go
They're
to
in your
Dave?
they're in your spam, I would imagine.
Yeah, I saw that you were addressed there.
Okay.
You're right,
Well,
there
Well,
it is.
either way, we can add them today.
yeah,
let's
those
add
can
them
be
today.
added today. I think, and we don't. There's nothing jaw dropping coming out of the recommendations for our discussion this morning, so we can quickly go over that. I think it's easily going to probably won't take us the full hour, but we can get on that. And today is MSE and Biological Research Program Day with some economics after lunch. So can we? I can't do it, but can Dave, maybe, can you put the report on the screen?
That's going to take me a moment to do. Can you just share your screen? Is that easier? I'm not linked in at the moment. I've got a whole bunch of other stuff open that probably doesn't want to be projected.
Try.
Can you? Let's see.
I'd be happy to do it, but I'm not currently set up to share.
Yeah. All right, I can do it. Just give me a moment. Just going to close everything else.
Close Amazon. Get some shopping.
All right. Secretary can make me a presenter. I think I already am. Let's come back to it because I'm not actually even logged into the meeting at the moment itself. So just
I don't.
If
There really
the
isn't
technical
anything
staff could,
Sorry, go
I mean,
ahead.
if the technical staff can make me a presenter, I can present.
Yeah, let's just do that. So, Secretary, if you could just make Olaf a presenter, you share his screen.
Great, thanks. I just have to pull up the version that Dave sent out. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Great. So this was the first item here, and it was just keeping in these two requests from SRB 18.
So the bullet 10 there, I've highlighted in my version. That's from last year, so we need to update that. So if you just highlight that as needing
Okay.
updating.
Yeah, there was some updates to it based on what we could hear, and you can see there's like a 4 just to continue to add on to If there's anything else you need to add in, yeah.
I don't recall us talking about. Oh, did we talk? The observers talk about that?
It was hard to hear some of it, so yeah, just go ahead and review and update it.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I didn't have Carrie's comments.
Yeah, I have Gary's email, so.
All right, and then here's the comments for the FIS.
We especially appreciated the drafting of bullet 12, paragraph 12. Totally appreciated that.
Yeah, we all agreed with that for sure.
Yeah, we strongly agreed with that.
So this text here in 13, I think essentially what we're trying to do is amplify some things that Ray had mentioned about, and that we had discussed about the value of including the Bering Sea region for CDE in sampling.
We didn't have those extra slides that Ray presented on this topic, so we couldn't really go back and review them specifically.
It looks like this bullet has been fixed up a little bit to include that reference to figures 1, 2, and 3, and the 3 alternative sampling designs. Shall I keep going?
Okay, not hearing anything. Move on.
Oh, and they're included here. Great. I think the first one that's real meaty is number 18. Yep.
Yeah, so I just put in, you had recommended there, and I just put in there whether you want that as a request for the Secretary to action, so it would become a requested, versus if you want the Commission to specifically endorse that recommendation. Either way is easy for us.
Yeah, I think yeah, I think we'll go back over this afternoon in our drafting session this afternoon.
Okay.
We can talk about which one we want to do. So if we just put a note to go back to that. Dave, just to clarify, and I know it's probably up above in the text, but recommended is something that, you know, if we have more of a vague request, doesn't have any specific timelines and deliverables, correct?
So requested and recommendation, you should have very specific deliverables, timeframes, and tasking associated with both of them. The requested is just an informal request if you just want Ray, for example, to undertake some additional analysis. If you would like the Commission specifically to be, attention to be drawn to that topic, then you would make it a recommendation. It's just a slight direction of where you want it to go, whether it's just for the Secretariat versus you want the Commissioners to specifically take note that you're recommending a course of action.
Okay. So recommended is more targeted towards the commission, and
it can still be a recommendation to the Secretariat, but you just want the Commission to be acutely aware of it and whether they would like to, as a result of that, amend it. Whereas a request for action is just going to come straight to us and we will implement it to the best of our abilities.
Gotcha. Okay, so then in terms of 19, okay, hearing nothing, we can move on. Do we have any other recommendations and requests?
Well, I don't see them here.
Let me see. I can open up the last version just to make sure. I don't want to get too confused having multiple versions open, but I see the numbering is different. We only had that one in here for the length weight.
Yeah, so what we do at the end of each presentation, the presenter will summarize a couple of key points that they feel the SRB is now noted, or some other format, and add those in as additional background. And then you have your specific, in this case, recommendation, which should be there.
Okay, this is one we're working on here. I see. So this 18 is what we had in there, and 19 is newly added.
Yeah.
That didn't come from the SRB there.
That's right. So if you can review that, that's why it's highlighted as well.
That was the draft. That was the, yeah.
I'm just putting a note in there for us, Sean.
Yep, yeah, that's fine.
A competition? Yeah, so this 22 is the one that we worked on last night.
I guess we can recommend continue. I mean, it's going to continue anyway, I think.
Dave, do we need to be more specific about this if we recommend or request?
Just reading through it again, sorry. With this, I think if it's just something that is going to continue on, I think just a simple request to continue the analysis is fine.
Okay.
We'll have another review of it as a team here and see if there is any more specificity that's needed. And we can chime in later today as well.
Whale depredation was where we ended yesterday.
Yeah, so this one here came down to, this would be the only one really where we had more substantive issues that generally questioning whether it's really worth pursuing at all, incorporating this into the space-time model, since the effect was quite small and without seeing the impact on the stock assessment, which might not even notice whether this was done or not.
Yeah, is Ray there? We were talking about the one figure that was presented showing essentially almost no change to the index, whether or not whale depredation was accounted for, and
Hi,
then,
Olaf, I'm here.
yeah, okay, great. What did you think about that, Ray? I mean, that sort of suggested to us that this is not an area that's likely to be productive unless that figure was somehow showing something that might be an underestimate of the potential impact.
I think the most helpful figure was the one on regulatory area 4A. Maybe I didn't draw enough attention to that. But it showed, so you might be thinking of the one for 3A where there was no apparent difference, including these data or leaving them out. In 4A, there was a tightening of the credible intervals, and I think that's important, and I don't think I emphasized it enough. 4A is an area which is, it's one of the areas on the edge of the stock which is surveyed using a sub-area approach, and it does have a number of ineffective stations each year. And because of the way it's sampled in recent years, and with it being unsampled in 2020, it's running close to the line of whether it meets our target range for precision. And this is something I didn't discuss and probably should have. So anything that benefits precision of the index is a good thing. And adding, and because it's the area that's most affected by marine mammal depredation out of all areas, it's probably the key, the one area that's going to benefit in a noticeable way from including this additional data. So I think what you're saying is correct with respect to the other example, and it's probably correct with the other areas which were presented or haven't yet to be analyzed because they have smaller numbers of ineffective stations. But I think for 4A, it's a meaningful improvement in the index, and I would like to implement it, at least if your recommendation is that we just focus on 4A, limit the addition of those covariates to that area, I'd be comfortable.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Thanks, Ray. I just made a comment here so that we sort of we've captured some of this and can come back to that discussion later.
Things, Olaf
Yeah.
and Ray. One is, it would still be useful to see what the impact is on the assessment in many ways, and there are risks. One thing I don't quite understand yet is how does it impact the length composition and age composition data? Are they normally added anyway, even if there was depredation, or are they not added in the stock assessment?
So generally, I wouldn't include the age composition data from an ineffective station. However, we have such a large sample size of age composition data that I suspect there would be very little effect on the compositions of adding back these few stations. Also because 4A is part of biological region 4, which is going to be pooled with the Bering Sea. We generally have a pretty substantial sample size in that area. So I don't think you guys are, I think, correct. There's not going to be much of an appreciable effect on the assessment results. The greater effect will be on our survey planning and maintaining these lower CVs, especially since the biggest effect on the variance will be in previous years, not in the current year, where the terminal year's variance tends to be more influential in the assessment than historical years. So I don't think this is really a huge effect on the assessment, but it does set us up for, should we have a year in the future when we have extensive depredation, it could potentially become more important when that year is the terminal data point in the stock assessment. Really a question of whether this is the right thing to do rather than whether it has a huge effect on the current analysis.
Well, and I just don't think there is enough information for us to really judge whether it's the right thing to do from what we've seen, and that to some degree is my concern. As you say, there's a risk that things are going, I mean, the model could change its opinion, and it'll change the historic time series, whatever else, of the index. So some of those things are a bit worrying when we've seen so little. Other than that, it reduces the uncertainty in one area, which after all it's going to do simply because it now has more ends or more samples.
Well, I think that the point that Ray mentioned is really well taken in the importance of confidence intervals in areas which are proportionally less sampled, and perhaps what the SRB can do in crafting this is to note that in areas that are impacted by marine mammals, it's recognized that incorporation of depredation would be important, also recognizing that it may be 4A now, but it might be some other area in the future, right? And so to be mindful of potential importance in shifting distributions or in years or in regions where marine mammals may become an important issue, than keeping track of the marine mammals in situations where it might be desirable to extend areas where these corrections are needed, I think would be useful.
Okay, so this one's going to need a fairly lengthy paragraph, I think. So we'll work on that.
I'm just capturing some of the comments here in this comment bulletin, so bullet here, so we can get back to it later. And that's where we ended last night.
Might be something that we can, request some research on for next June, and especially when we're looking at the assessment in more detail then. Okay. So moving down. Okay, that's where we got to. I suppose, Olaf, if you, I guess, flip that back to Dave, and he can incorporate Sven's comments in there, and then we can start with this afternoon.
Sounds good. Dave, do you have Sven's comments, or shall I forward those?
Found them in my junk mail. Thanks.
Okay, good. Okay.
You better see if Mark Mangel's been sending you any. You do. Okay, well, that puts us on to the MSE update.
Okay, should I start the presentation then?
Great.
Yes, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I have a few things on the MSc program of work and a bit of update on some work in the MSc to present to the SRB this morning. And please let me know if any sort of audio issues occur or anything like that, or if you don't want to look directly at my face here. The topics I want to cover this morning are the variability in the MSc framework, which relates to an SRB request, the program of work, which came out of a special session, which occurred shortly after the last SRB meeting, SRB019. And then some results from a preliminary investigation of multi-year assessments. So as a reminder from SRB018 paragraph 30, the SRB requested the IPHC Secretariat present a revised system diagram of the MSE showing components of variability and their implementation within MSE. So we put a bit of thought into this and came up with an idea that hopefully works for you. As a reminder, this is a diagram we've been using for a number of years to just show the general MSE framework of the operating model and the management procedure and that closed loop simulation. And I just want to remind you here, note that there's really 5 general boxes where the operating model is simulating fisheries in a population, a halibut population. And the management procedure has been subdivided into 3 different boxes: a box for monitoring, meaning data collection, the estimation model, like the stock assessment, for example, as well as the harvest rule, which contains all those little extra parts of a management procedure, such as the control rule, size limits, distribution, etc. So just remember these 5 general boxes within this MSE framework. And what we've done is created a table where these 5 boxes are now the columns along the top. So we have the population, fisheries, monitoring, estimation model, and the harvest rule. And what we've done is along the rows, we've split out a bunch of categories of different sources of variability. And these categories actually come from a paper by Leach et al. In 2014, which was really inspired by a figure that was created for a swordfish MSE. I think, if I remember right, was it through ICAT? But anyways, I just remember the swordfish MSE and this figure showing sources of variability, and this is what really started to inspire a lot of this. So what we've done is now you can sort of cross-reference a category along the rows with these different elements of the MSE framework and the sources of variability within those. So let's take a look, for example, at the population column and the population structure category. And you can see there are 5 different types of or sources of variability that can be included in the simulation model. There's many more than that, but we've identified 5 here that are likely important to Pacific halibut. We've numbered sources that are actually included in the current MSE framework and the current MSE operating model. And then in bullet points and italics are sources of variability that are not currently included in the operating model. So this gives you a general idea of what is included in the MSE framework and what may be important to Pacific halibut and the management of Pacific halibut, but is currently not included. So for example, what's not included are different sources of different hypotheses about stock structure. And also changes in movement on an annual basis. Even though if you look down here, movement does have some variability related to environmental regimes. So if you remember, movement can change with the high or low classified environmental regime. So hopefully this provides, an idea. It's not pretty. It's sometimes a little bit hard to get your head around. So what we decided to do was actually make this into a figure and create a figure that is similar to the MSE framework and those elements of the MSE framework, except now it's colored blue, and the blue indicates that these are sources of variability.
So we've populated those same 5 boxes, and now we've put those different sources of variability in each of the boxes. So you can see exactly what is implemented in the current MSE operating model and management procedures in terms of variability. So basically, it's taken each column from that previous table and taken all the numbered items and put them in here, so you can see how they fit in and what they are. So I wanted to focus on one aspect which is actually new this year. Going back, yes, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just before you change topics,
Sure.
I just wanted to ask, is there a reason like the choice of the word variability versus uncertainty, and are they being used interchangeably?
Yeah, the choice of variability is actually something we've thought about a lot, and really what we're thinking about, well, there are two aspects to this. One is sort of the historical variability and uncertainty that we want to incorporate when conditioning the model and creating those starting points for the simulations. But there's also the variability into the future. And yeah, I've basically thought about it as more variability, even though it is uncertainty. But
Like if you go
yeah,
back to your table, if you go back to your table, so when you say variability, I look at things like number of bioregions, and why would that, I interpret variability as, randomness kind of from year to year or from event to event versus,
right.
so it might be, and I'm not sure if this comes from this Leach paper or not, but it might be good to use uncertainty and the categories within the broad definition of uncertainty. I think that would work here, because you have things like, observation uncertainty, process uncertainty, structural uncertainty, and that would easily line up with a lot of your categories. They could all be put into one of those classes, I think.
Yeah, I see your point. And we tried to do that a bit, with monitoring the data, that's uncertain data that are coming in. The model is providing uncertainty in the estimation over on this part of the figure. But things like growth, there's variability in growth from year to year, although that is
Yeah,
uncertain
but that's
exactly how the variability occurs. But that's,
process
variability,
uncertainty, though. But
process
within
uncertainty.
uncertainty, who is it? I think it was the Francis paper, right? The risk in fisheries paper, where he did 7 categories of uncertainty, and that would easily fall within one of those.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess I definitely see your point in terms of simulating forward in time. Yeah, I see how it can be called uncertainty. I'm happy to change it to uncertainty,
It might
and
be,
I'll
yeah. I'm
definitely
just,
take a look into that.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
just to keep things aligned, Okay, you can continue. Sorry for
Yeah.
interrupting.
No. That's a good conversation, and it certainly is important when I'm communicating these types of things, is to have a very consistent language and one that does make sense. So I do
Yeah,
appreciate it. So then we created this. If I may note, there's one place where I'm very adamant on calling it variability and not uncertainty, and that's in sort of implementation error. Well, see, I just made the mistake, and not calling it error, but calling it implementation variability.
Well,
So,
it would be called
yeah,
implementation. I
I'll
mean, the
try.
literature calls it implementation uncertainty.
I know.
I mean, uncertainty is
Yeah, and
essentially
I think
just
that's
a
actually a good.
probability graph, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it can be applied to
yeah.
anything.
Yeah. Okay. So I do like that. Yeah. All right. So moving on. One aspect of new in this uncertainty variability is the distribution of larvae in the operating model. And so what that means are, well, the way the operating model currently works is there's just one coast-wide spawning biomass that contributes a recruitment in a year that has variability and uncertainty around it. And then that coast-wide recruitment event is then distributed among the 4 different biological regions. And the operating model in the past has assumed that the proportion of recruitment going to each region is constant every year. So it only has one vector of proportions, and that just remains constant throughout the model. So I wanted to make some improvements to that process and allow it to vary over time, have that distribution vary over time. And this is the way that we implemented it. So before I get into the details of that, something that we have been thinking about a lot is that there's going to be a lot of confounding between movement and recruitment distribution. And this occurs for a number of reasons. One is that the operating model is mostly conditioned to age 6+ fish. So it doesn't have, oh boy, here we go. Yeah, we're okay. Sorry. The model being conditioned to mostly age 6 fish is it's mostly looking at those adult fish, and it doesn't really have a really good picture of what's happening in movement of those young fish. So you think of it this way, you can have larvae distributed in some way and then they move, but you can have movement be different to have a different set of way to account for a different way of distributing the larvae. So there's that confounding there between the movement, especially of young fish, and how they're distributed at age 0. So the other part of the problem here is that there is not much data historically to really inform the recruitment distribution, and the recent data is mainly informing that in where the fish currently are, again, being confounded with movement at young ages. However, one part of this problem is that there were large catches early in the time series, like in the 1920s, that need to be supported by the model. And those large catches occurred in region 2. And so the model has to get enough fish into region 2 to support those catches. And that's actually a choke point in any of the models that I've conditioned from the time I've been at the IPHC. Is if I'm doing a long model, it has to get through that little bottleneck of the late 20s and 1930s in terms of supporting the catches in region 2. So some things to think about. It's not that I'm looking to estimate these parameters. I'm just looking to have these parameters there to develop scenarios. The way that we implemented this was through a multinomial logit equation, noting that the way it was implemented before was very simple, and it was just a proportion of a vector of proportions put in there, and then the last proportion is 1 minus all the sum of the previous. So it didn't work very well in terms of the conditioning process, and I had to put bounds on it and do all these little things to make sure the proportions didn't exceed 1 or turn into negative numbers. This is a much more, well, I'd say it's a better solution, more elegant, and it allows for what I think would be better estimation. And it's basically a logit type equation, but you still have to fix one of the regions, this eta coming out at the very end of it. You have to fix that at 0, and then all of the other proportions end up being relative to that one region, which is fine, but that's just due to the degrees of freedom. The other nice thing about this, this implementation is now we have parameters alpha, beta, and gamma here in the bottom, and some of those parameters can be related to a covariate, and that covariate can be related to time. So we can link these proportions directly to an environmental covariate or any other covariate, or just put in a covariate that modifies it through time in some very specific way. So my thought on this was eventually we can link it to the high and low PDO regimes and then expand from there. So just as an example, because I always have to get this to my head, how these things sort of work. Here are, I'll back up one slide here. Assuming that beta and gamma are 0, so just eliminate the beta and the gamma part, eta equals alpha, just to give me an idea how this works with different levels of alpha. If alphas are all the same, the proportions come out the same. If 2 of the alphas are the same, those 2 will be the same, and then here's what happens when you differ the alphas. So it's just a way to verify in my mind how it worked and then get a feel for the range of these parameters, what I should be actually looking for in the operating model. And I haven't presented it here, but what I've done is with this new implementation, I've translated these parameters to the old proportions that were set in the operating model, and I now have it an exact match, but using this new parameterization for the previous simulations. So the idea here is, and this is something I'm currently working on, and so I don't have any results to present you at this time, but the idea here is to allow for these nonlinear relationships with a temporal covariate, like an environmental covariate. It improves the parameters when conditioning. It improves just the process of conditioning. But the downside is that we have not implemented a process that allows for just random annual proportions of distribution over time. This is linked to that covariate. That's the temporal aspect of it. And so we haven't actually done something that could just be a random deviate. The idea is to then experiment with this and develop some scenarios for the operating model, and to also investigate how much confounding there actually is between the movement and this distribution. And talking with the research branch, we've had a lot of meetings with the research branch about movement and recruitment distribution. My explanation to them was, you set up the population in some sort of way, distributed, those age 0 fish distributed, and then movement has to occur over a number of years to get the fish to the locations that they're observed. And that's why there's that confounding. If you don't set up the fish properly in the beginning, movement might have to do something weird to get the fish and the observations to where they need to be. So that's what we have for the presentation of variability uncertainty. And just take a brief pause before moving on to the next topic. One thing that we will have for the SRB in June is more results of those investigations of the confounding between movement and recruitment distribution, and some additional scenarios to use as simulated, in the simulation.
Yeah, I think one thing I would recommend that you do is don't jump right into making everything random. To try to understand the deterministic behavior very well, look at what affects the equilibrium biomass distribution under different harvest strategies or fishing mortality rates, if that's how you're doing it. Try to sort out, for example, why you have that bottleneck.
Yeah.
At 2B or something, those things, adding random simulations is just going to take up time and make it harder to figure out. And it might even mask things that you should be paying attention to, so initially.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and that's the approach we have been taking with the operating model. A year and a half ago, when I presented the first sort of results of the multi-region operating model, we had a bit of a discussion about that, and it just wasn't gelling. It just wasn't coming together without some sort of variability in the movement rates. And so I believe it was Olaf suggested and the SRB recommended that we at least begin to tie movement rates to the environmental regimes. So instead of, just throwing in randomness, begin to try to link it to processes and understand if there's these processes that help the system. And so that is the approach we've been taking. But for that bottleneck and things, it's just really hard to get those fish where they need to be in the 1920s and to match the current data sets we've been seeing. So we've been thinking about two approaches. One is to introduce more variability. The second approach is to ignore that early time period and create more of a short operating model, maybe starting in the 1980s or something, to see if that is adequate and maybe an additional scenario to add to the simulations.
Yeah, I mean, the other option is to explore alternative hypotheses for these things. I mean, linking it to an environmental variable, yeah, maybe, but there's also intrinsic dynamics going on. There could be density dependent movement. It could be things that are more intrinsic to it, rather than driven externally. I mean, I'm sure, Kim has studied this probably in a lot more detail than I have, but recently we've been looking at, our herring models that have been driven by external, just time varying natural mortality. We're looking at kind of depensatory mortality, and it's actually explaining just as much. And it solves a lot of issues. It makes a lot more, ecological sense. And it's just another, it's another hypothesis, but it's got pretty significant implications. If something is driven by a random environmental input versus an intrinsic property, it has huge implications for your harvest strategies. So that would be my, one of the things I think of, would be a recommendation would be to, explore some different hypotheses, given, all of you.
Density dependent movements, as well as some of these environmental covariates. And Alan, I think it might help if you can just sort of let us know here how much you've gone down this path, because I don't want to put a recommendation in here that makes you kind of beat your head against the wall and keep trying things if you've already done a lot of this stuff.
No, I completely agree. I think that's a great suggestion, recommendation. We are definitely on the road of exploring alternative hypotheses, and what we've really been doing in the last couple of months is having a lot of conversations with the research team and reviewing the literature, just to make sure that we have, that we're not just trying to develop hypotheses out of the blue, that we have some reason for developing these hypotheses. So yeah, I think any recommendation you guys would make would be helpful here, because we haven't explored a whole lot yet, and if we're in alignment with what you think would be best, I think that would be most optimal moving forward.
Great. Yeah, I would hate to see you cut out the early data until you've kind of run down all the different leads for ways of explaining it. That would be just removing that data is in some ways just kind of admitting defeat, and more importantly, I think it's ignoring some potentially informative dynamics from the past.
I would agree, and that's why I haven't removed it yet. But boy, it would speed up my simulations a bit if I didn't have that in there.
I understand the temptation.
Uh-huh. Anything else before we move on? Okay, the next SRB 18 request from paragraph 36 was the SRB requested the IPHC Secretariat prioritize tasks for the MSc program of work that lead to adoption of well-defined management procedure, taking into account interdependencies among tasks, presenting tasks as linked sets. So I'm not going to present to the SRB a lot of the details that I presented to the Commission at the special session 11. And I do note, I think the special session occurred maybe a week or two after SRB 18. So this request was actually very pertinent to that special session. And I communicated that to the Commission that this was of importance to the SRB. And in fact, what we did in that special session was identified from the Secretariat point of view a number of tasks that would satisfy this SRB request, and then allowed the Commission to have their discussion and prioritize a full set of tasks, noting that we thought there's a certain set of tasks that would help lead to the adoption of a management procedure. So that's basically what I said. And in summary, what the Commission came out of the 11th special session was 4 general categories, and there's some specific tasks within each of these categories. But further development of the operating model, to look at multi-year assessments that mean that there's not an assessment every year, but instead every 2 or 3 years. They were very interested in size limits and would like to see more analysis on size limits to bring in sort of long-term implications of size limits, rather than a lot of the analyses we've been doing in the last few years have been really focused on, given current conditions, what would have happened if there was a difference in size limit. And then they were also interested in improving the communication of results, which is something I'm always striving to do, and I always think that I can improve on. But they specifically called it out, and I think that would be helpful for the Secretariat, as well as potentially the MSAB or some stakeholders, to really have a think about how we can better communicate the results and better assist the Commission in making a decision of a management procedure and a harvest policy. So here's a table of some specific tasks that are of priority to the Commission for the program of work 2021 to 23. They have some labeling related to the category. So there's 4 different tasks related to the framework. And that's really to improve the operating model by developing these alternative scenarios, introducing implementation uncertainty. I do like that. And then develop more realistic simulations of the estimation error. If you remember, we hadn't quite got to a point where we felt really good about simulating the assessment. We were using a simple approach of just putting random error around estimated values, and then developing these alternative operating models. In terms of management procedures, the size limits, multi-year assessments, and then the presentation of results. So there is a MSE program of work document available on the IPHC website under the MSE research section. And that is what will guide us for the next, until 2023, the annual meeting then. Yeah.
Sort of unbiased zero mean variability in implementation, but the potential for actual implementation bias, where the cuts are less likely to happen than the increases in harvest.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important thing to investigate as well. What happens if in the implementation phase the cuts don't happen when the control rule says they should?
Yeah, and definitely one thing we've done in the past is just run a harvest rule without a control rule to compare and see those risks that occur then. But I agree is having some sort of relationship with the lower the stock status gets, maybe it's there's more push against taking the actual or following the actual management procedure. So we at the last SRB, I believe I presented some look at historical decision-making process as a start to trying to implement some sort of uncertainty in implementation. But you're right, there's places that the MSE simulation is going to go that we've never gone before in the IPHC, and we need to present those to the commission as potential sources of bias and variability. So
yeah, and one way, to tie it into the past data is to say, okay, this is the 30-20 control rule performance. And here is the 30-20 control rule performance if you apply an additional filter, which is to say that decreases in quota can never be greater than those observed in the past.
Okay.
So trying to tie it into past data, what's the biggest cut we've ever seen in the past, either absolute or percentage wise, and assume that that's really all there is tolerance for. If that's true, then how does this control rule perform? I think those kind of comparisons will be really useful.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. I like that method. Okay, thanks, Olaf. If there's no other comments at this point in time, I just want to continue on with the program of work, but show some results from this multi-year assessment, some management procedure with a multi-year assessment that we had simulated as part of the last round of the MSE, but it was never really presented given the priority of the other management procedures. So as a reminder, in the last round of the MSE, we evaluated 11 different management procedures that were labeled A through K. And what came out of that last round of evaluations, there were 2 management procedures, D and J, that were sort of the best ranking given the primary objectives that are being used currently at this time as well. And those were D and J. I'm not going to go into the details of those because really the important part of this presentation is MPA, which is as close as we can get to simulating the current interim management procedure with its O32 stock distribution, relative harvest rates for the different regulatory areas, an agreement for 2A and 2B in the green down there. And then we've contrasted that with A2, which includes a biennial assessment and setting of the mortality limits. So the way that this works is A2 differs from MPA only in the sense that the mortality limits are set for a 2-year period and held constant for that 2-year period. And you'll see that in some plots that are coming up. But the key is that it's constant between assessments. And I've included D and J just for comparison if necessary. So here are some simulated trajectories, or the spaghetti plots as you've talked about. What I've plotted for each management procedure is the TCY on the vertical axis and that thick median line we were talking about yesterday that just is really not very exciting at all. And then some quantiles around those lines in red and blue on the top for MPA and A2. And then I've hand-picked a few actual trajectories to contrast the trajectories between these two management procedures. And noting that these are hand-picked out of 500 different trajectories to show a range of different potential trajectories. The first thing that you really see is the constant in the red, the 2-year constant. So you get these stepping stones. And in contrast to the blue line, you can see that you know, it follows that blue line pretty well, but in more of a stair-step fashion, which is the way that it's implemented. If you look here in the early part of the simulations, you see some differences. One, there's, you know, the red is constant for that first year until assessment occurs. And then there are some trajectories that, you know, decline as you see in the lower part and then remain low for a long period of time before coming back. Whereas the blue has some variability in the TZY, but sort of can get kicked off without having to drop the stock to really low levels in a few of those simulations. So these are the spaghetti plots, and I like, you know, it's been a few times I've heard a number of different people suggest I present these, and I think they would be useful. So if the SRB has any recommendations on how to improve the presentation of these types of plots, how to best communicate them, I would be very interested in to hear your suggestions. Another thing I noticed here is there are these few cases. Sorry, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree that showing the spaghetti lines definitely gives a better impression of what your life might look like. The thing that strikes me about this top graph is the lower percentile there. Is that the 5th percentile, or what is that?
If I remember correctly, I think it is the 5th.
Yeah, those are quite different, and they're in the short term as well. They all the action happens there before the year 2030. It suggests there's a significant amount of catch risk difference between them as to when and how long it lasts.
Yeah, I would agree.
And it might be, you know, important to communicate that again. So, you know, not really focusing as much on the median, but you know, there are some options there that shut the fishery down. It's not out of the realm of possibility. So I think if you then, and this probably, I think to some degree reflects Olaf's concern that the catches won't be changing as much as your MP harvest control rule, because you've got that 15% change limit on there, which is going to create a bit of a drag, right?
Yeah, and that's only in the bottom two. The top, the red and the blue do not have that 15% change imposed.
I got you. Okay. Yeah.
And that's why the blue line where this arrow is, you can see that blue line has some really interesting dips. And I think that's just the stock status might be estimated at a level where the control rule kicks in. And then the next year it says, oh, it's not actually, and then it allows it to come back. And that doesn't occur in the stair step approach as much, which is really interesting to me. A little bit maybe there, but you see it just sort of smooth.
Won't be reacting annually. It'll be reacting every 2 data points. So there's feedback to the assessment as well.
Yeah. So yeah, I think these types of plots. But no, you go ahead.
It's not responding to that year-to-year variability as much.
Yeah.
Well, it's not actually doing any averaging. It's just conducting an assessment every other year, and then it's making those decisions on that single assessment, biennial assessment. So it's not doing any averaging over that, but it still seems to have less variability from the annual assessment. And it might be that, you know, you're just seeing half of the variability because you only see it every 2 years, and so you just happen to not see those very specific, those large swings on site shows.
You're still collecting the data though.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than, you know, update it with 1 data point and react to it, you're actually adding 2 data points. So that's what Olaf is saying.
Yeah, that's the averaging.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is definitely an interesting, and the commission is very interested. As you can see, they've prioritized this type of investigation for the program of work.
Yeah, they definitely have different risk implications for harvesters, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think in the short term, right?
Yeah.
But not in the long term.
No, but
And I think
I mean,
that's really the difficult bit. You kind of have very different risks because of where you are right now. Whereas you can be anywhere by having a management that keeps the biomass level at a reasonable level. I mean, I find, and it's something I said to Alan before, that the difference between these management plans is so minute that it's difficult to actually draw generalities. You're always worried that that may just be one particular simulation that's causing it because it went slightly differently. And I can't say that you can make decisions based on the management, long-term management decision based on these small differences as to what type of procedure you might want to choose. I mean, when I looked at, you remember you sent me those, the output tables from the simulations? I look and the multivariate analysis, which I believe is the ideal way of trying to communicate these characteristics. What are the implications of certain management strategy or management measure types, such as, length, changing the minimum landing size or things like that, would be very useful. But there is so little contrast in the breadth of the plans that you've looked at that it's very difficult to see that clearly what the differences are in more sort of grander categorical terms.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I think that's where the MSAB comes in pretty handy is we have some stakeholders, that are very focused on specific regulatory areas. And that's where we can really start to see some of the differences between these management procedures. On a coast-wide level, yeah, they all produce very similar things, but where the catch or the mortality limit, the TCY, goes to for a specific regulatory area can differ quite a bit between these management procedures. And that's where a lot of the discussion occurs. And I think that's where I can make an improvement in the communication, is communicating that, exactly as you said, Sven, that there are very small differences between these management procedures in terms of long-term coast-wide look at it. But where are the differences, and finding where those differences are and where the importance is where I think we can put in a bit of work in the communication.
Ian, related to that, how much is the MSAB asking you to give them information about performance in terms of variability in the quota versus the long-term average quota? Because I would think that the performance in the long-term average quota is very similar for these, but I suspect they're pretty different in terms of their interannual variability, since you set the same quota for 2 years for A2.
Yeah, great question. And the MSAB has definitely been very interested in the variability. I think originally they didn't realize how interested they were in the variability until they started seeing some output. And then it became the major focus. And that's why things like the 15% maximum change from year to year and other things like that, they started, it's of such big interest that they actually want to, instead of seeing if a management procedure meets their variability objective, they want to put the objective into the management procedure and make sure that it never happens.
I see. Okay, so it's kind of hardwired in there.
Yeah, it definitely is, and we've actually talked about maybe putting it at the regulatory area level as well, because it's so important to them. And I have a few other slides that actually begin to talk about that variability, specifically comparing A and A2.
Great.
Shall I move on to those performance metrics then? I'll take that as a consensus. So the first thing I'd like to present are these coast-wide performance metrics. And again, just focusing on the two columns A and A2. And then D and J are in there just for reference as well. But here's the performance metric of the stock falling below 20% relative spawning biomass. And you see across all these management procedures with the exact implementation of the control rule that risk is very small. And as we've learned in past simulations, is that control rule just really keeps the stock above 20%. It's drastic, it's extreme, it's effective, you might say. Another objective is to look at the probability the relative spawning biomass is less than 36%. As Ian mentioned yesterday, this 36% came from an analysis we did a couple of years ago that is somewhat, this is what we think might be a coast-wide sort of MEY type reference point based on some analyses we did. And so a lot of people are beginning to think of this 30% as a target. And one thing we've looked at is how can we, what sort of management procedure would maintain the stock above and below 36% with a 50% probability on each side. And so you can see these management procedures are all maintaining the stock above 36% with a greater than 50% probability. And there's slight differences between them. So one thing we've thought of doing is actually finding the SPR that tunes these management procedures to match that target and maintain it above and below 36% with a 50% probability. The median average TCY in the long term, or actually this is in the short term, this is 14 years out approximately in the simulations. So these fishery sustainability ones, the average TCY, the bottom three are in the short term. And so you see these are the median average TCY, telling us there's differences, and I think it does indicate, as Sean was showing, that there is some loss, that there's a potential risk to TCY with that biennial assessment in the short term. So it is lower than the other management procedure A. And then here are the variability ones. The two variability ones are the probability that any 3 years out of 10, the change in the TCY is greater than 15%. And you see with a biennial assessment, that's lower. And that's because mainly you're only changing the TCY in 5 of those 10 years anyways. And then the last one is the average annual variability. And you see that that's lower, and that's averaged over a 10-year period as well. And that's lower for A2. So if you look on the surface here, in these primary objectives defined by the MSAB and the Commission, you see that the variability objectives are improved by implementing a biennial assessment. And my best guess is implementing a triennial assessment, these performance metrics will improve even more because you're just not changing the TCY as often. So we thought, well, and many stakeholders have asked me, well, what happens when the TCY actually changes? Are you going to change it by doubling and halving it all the time, but you only do that every other year? So we decided to look at some additional performance metrics to get at that. And these are the probability that any 1 year out of 10, the TCY is greater than 15%, and any 2 years out of 10, the TCY is greater than 15%. And both of those metrics with the biennial assessment and mortality limit setting process, you see that that it's actually greater. So when it does change, it tends to be greater than when it's changing on an annual basis. And then the final performance metric we've developed here is a maximum absolute percent change in the TCY. So over that 10-year period, what is the maximum percent change seen in that 10-year period? And more often, with the biennial assessment, the maximum change in a 10-year period is greater than what would see in an annual assessment. So the conclusion here really is that when you're changing the mortality limit every second year, the change you have to make is going to be greater than any change you'll see on average in annual change type scenario. And so I've plotted those out with violin plots to show that, because there's a little bit of an interesting result. You see D and J have that 15% cap on them, but A and A2 do not, and so you can get some very large changes in the TCY. What I found most interesting is the biennial assessment really has a bulb of observations or outputs from the simulations ranging from about 10 to 60 or so percent change in that maximum. But the annual change has a bulb in the bottom. It's almost bimodal, but also has a few times where it changes greatly. And I think that's what we were seeing in the spaghetti plots, those drastic sudden changes, whether the assessment was wrong or it just didn't know what to do. And so you have, on a median is different, but looking at the whole distribution of the simulations, you see some interesting results pop out. I think that's what I have. Well, yeah, we'll stop there if you want to pause for a moment.
Yeah, I have a couple of issues. One with this plot, and I don't recall the previous table. Were you looking at? Were you also looking at the absolute or the percent change distribution without being absolute, like negative changes versus positive changes? Because I'm wondering that 1,000%, it would matter a lot whether it's an up or a down.
Yeah, and I originally did start looking at it in that way. I've looked at some other metrics in the past, looking at how often it changes negative versus positive and see which direction. We did not do that for this analysis right now, but I think that would be important. Another axis that we've been thinking of looking at related to that is those 100%. Are those occurring when the TCY is set at 2 and then it changes to 4 the next year? Or is it when it's 50 and it's changing to 100? I think sort of splitting it out and getting a better feel for it, both positive, negative, as well as the absolute levels would be helpful as well. We did not look at it for these results, but looking at management procedures D and J, there definitely was asymmetry in, I can't remember what it was. It would be in the annual meeting presentation. I'm thinking that it was more in management procedure D, it was more often a greater positive change than a negative change. So negative changes tended to be small, but positive tended to be large. But don't quote me on that. I can look that up if you want to.
Yeah. I think those things matter, right? I mean, nobody minds an occasional windfall, but people do mind the opposite.
My other comment is just going back up to your performance measures table. Like, there really is nothing in here about, like, this is just about variability, which is like saying, I'm gonna roll some dice and see what the average, difference between faces is. If it's not really reflecting, like, if you go back up again, like these three here, so you're talking about the median, the probability any changes are 15%, but similarly, like 15%, 15% downward changes in a row are really bad, right? And this doesn't represent that much. So if you go up again, go back to the graphs. So again, to me, I see a definite difference between the A procedures and the other two. If you think about, let's say, a fisherman who is within 10 years of retiring and selling his stake in the fishery, what he should be interested in is the lower fifth percentile of that catch distribution. And what that's suggesting, because that's basically saying, it's possible within the next, 10 years, you're going to lose it all. It won't be worth anything, or it'll have some long-term value, but you're talking a significant possible drop in your quota value over the next 10 years versus, if you ask me, like, if this is your retirement plan, you're going to retire in the next few years, where do you want your money managed by, mutual fund A or mutual fund D? And I would choose D, right? Because in the medians are trivially different, but the risk is hugely different. And if you just divided the fifth percentile, whatever the average of the fifth percentile over the next 10 years for one of those top ones, and divided it by the bottom one, those fifth percentiles are I don't know, 10 times different. So you're talking like a 10-fold difference in risk. If that's your risk measure, which is, we typically always report that, the fifth percentile of catch, because that's something that, is kind of the least first you. And sometimes if the median isn't telling you much different, then you would choose the one that is a better bet, right? It's a safer bet.
Yeah, I'm wondering if my concern about just looking at those lower percentiles is one of the percentiles might be 5 million pounds, and the other percentile is 15 million pounds. And I think to any stakeholder, both of those are unacceptable. 5 or 15, they're like, well, I'm not going to go fishing either way. But so I'm wondering if a better potential metric is the probability of the
I'm sorry,
TCY
I'm not,
being.
What are you talking about? 5 versus 15? Are you talking about comparing A and A2 or A and D, or A or A2 and D?
Well, I'm talking more in general in comparing these. And I'm just offering maybe an alternative metric is the probability that the TCY is less than 25 million pounds, or some level that's defined by the stakeholders as a level that they would or would not go fishing or would need to be profitable. And my concern is that, if you are looking at A and A2, there's a difference of, say, in 2028 or something like that. I don't think either one of those would be acceptable to a stakeholder.
No, that's what I'm saying.
But
I'm saying I'm comparing like the top graph and the bottom graph, not really. Within the top graph there are some issues, but I think the bigger difference is the two graphs.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think that shows the implementation of this 15% change, the usefulness of that. And we've definitely concluded that having some sort of constraint on the change in the TCY is important for the stakeholders. But I'm wondering, in terms of, I think what I'm hearing you say is that a stakeholder would be interested in evaluating the risk to them over the next 20, 30 years, or wherever they are in their career, and would perhaps introducing a metric that is more related to what they would desire to actually maintain a business Of course, we want higher, but is there a break-even point? You know, if I'm going to go out and present to the SRB and not get paid, would I do that, or would I need to have some minimum amount to be paid to come and talk to you all?
Yeah,
I'm
and
not going to
I think
answer that
something like,
question,
I mean, the
but
fifth percentile is pretty standard, you know, in like value at risk calculations. The fifth percentile is pretty well accepted. What I, what I wouldn't want to do is go, now you're kind of presenting something to individual fishermen, and you're kind of asking them to make a probability value trade-off, which is, you know, who knows how they even think about probability. So the nice thing
yeah,
about choosing a fifth percentile is like that takes it out of you can just call it lowest catch, right? Lowest
okay,
guaranteed catch,
yeah,
something like that, where you don't have to talk about probability.
that makes sense too. I mean, who knows how people interpret probability?
Hmm. Because one of the things that it's a bigger topic, but um, yeah, I won't get into it now, but it's something we could talk about someday over beer,
Yeah,
about
no, that
differences in
would be great.
probability.
And I do know,
About
yeah, I do note in the MSC Explorer that, you know, we present, I think, close to 300 different performance metrics within regulatory areas at the coastwide level. And some of those performance metrics are the quantiles for various different measures, such as TCY. We report the 5th, the 25th, the 50th, the 75th, and the 95th percentiles. And the stakeholders do look at those quite often, and many of the plots we create have the median with the bars representing 25th to 75th and 5th to 95th. And the MSAB actually requested the 25th and 75th percentiles to get an idea of the range.
Thanks.
That may be a good discussion for the MSAB if that may be an additional performance metric of use to them.
Just
I had
since we're taking a breather, we are at a break time here. We're at 10:30, and we are scheduled for a 15-minute break
yeah I was
right
gonna
now.
Yeah, I was going to note, Sean, that I just have maybe, I think, two just quick summary slides if you want to do those and then take a break.
Okay,
Or we can come
sure.
back and I can summarize it after the break, either way.
Yeah, sure. So let's go till 10:45. Get these done by then,
Okay.
and then we'll just do our break 10:45 to 11.
Okay, yeah, this shouldn't take too long. Um, so in terms of the multi-year assessment, I note this is a constant TCY for 2 years. And really, we're seeing this trade-off between the annual change to biennial, which I knew that you all would catch on to really quick. But fixing the TCY for a 2-year period ignores that incoming data, not completely, as you mentioned, then the stock assessment's updated with 2 years of data. But I can see an issue when the FIS results are presented and the survey went up, you know, this great amount, and the TCY is fixed for this year, so we can't do anything about it. That may not go over too well. And so, what was my last point here? Yeah, so the other point is if adjustments were made every third year, then these performance metrics would improve as well. And so we do need to look at some very specific outcomes given these types of management procedures, which I think is exactly what the recommendations or the suggestions you've been making to me already. So we've been thinking, well, what would really be a desired sort of management procedure with a multi-year assessment? One is to look at a triennial assessment that may be desired from an analyst point of view. But we thought there's unlikely to be a period of years where the TCY is set constant. And so why don't we look at some empirical approaches in those non-assessment years and one thing I've been thinking of personally is this is the gateway to a total empirical approach. It's a nice way to introduce it. We'd still have an assessment occurring as to give comfort to some people that, you know, trust the assessment and want to see that full analysis. But in the interim, you'd have that empirical approach, which would be a nice way to introduce the idea of an empirical approach to stakeholders and commissioners. You could do that a number of ways. You could fix that coastwide TCY, but only update the distribution. You can have the TCY updated using the trend in the fifth survey, for example. You can use the results in some other way. Or you could actually just take the assessment and take the 2 or 3 year projection from the assessment to set the TCY for a 2 or 3 year period. And I think that's what some management agencies do when they're unable to assess a stock as often as we do at IPHC. So those were just the thoughts that we had on this multi-year assessment. Is there some improvements we'd like to make? And we'd like to bring in that empirical approach as an introduction to the empirical approach, and maybe it's the gateway drug to going to a full empirical approach type management procedure. So with that, just note the paper that's been supplied to you. The slides here on the proportion of recruitment distribution are not in that paper. And that's some relatively new stuff we've been working on. Make any recommendations for management procedure specifications, including what we discussed about the multi-year stock assessment. And I do note that in the program of work, it wasn't prioritized to continue looking at the current management procedures being investigated or evaluated, but I won't let that go. I do want to at least present those as contrast to what we'll be presenting in the next year or two. And then request any further analysis to be provided at June, especially if you have ideas about the operating model, for example. And with that, I think that's the end of my presentation. So thanks.
Thanks, Alan. Just to clarify, I believe you said those A procedures are based on the current, your approximation of the current one. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. MPA is the closest approximation to the current interim harvest policy that we could have, which does include the agreements for 2A and 2B, which are set to expire in 2023.
And MPs D and J does not include those agreements?
MPD does include the agreement, and it also has the allowance of increasing fishing intensity to accommodate those agreements. And MPJ does not have those agreements, but it includes a smoother, I think a 3-year average of stock distribution from the FIS to apply in the distribution step, which really fixed some of the variability for some of the regulatory areas, or improved it.
Do we have any other comments and issues from the SRB at this point? We've got about 7 minutes to the break.
Yes, ma'am. Well, I imagine a lot of things will change with alternative scenarios about movement. And I imagine that'll be something really focused for the SRB in June, is the improvements we've made to the operating model, the additional scenarios we've come in, and how that changes the view of what we've already learned from this.
Yeah, so in some ways, trying to decide on metrics that or metrics that highlight the differences between the management or the risks of the management of the different management plans and the benefits seems a bit premature if you're then going to change movement and everything changes completely.
If I could add something to this, I mean, we've been, since the MSE started, the SRB has been trying to encourage a streamlined approach to get an MP in place, tested and in place, given the current state of knowledge. I think the risk in saying, well, you can't do anything until we know more about movement or something like that, is that it's just pushing it down the road. It's going to create a reason to not do what we recommended earlier. So I think I agree with you that these effects may happen, but I think we have to kind of put it in the context of, well, you're doing a procedure anyway, regardless of whether you know that or not, and this is an ongoing process. That's why it's ongoing.
That was more my point, that the effort put into the movement element is detracting from the process of getting a management plan. And it may confuse people then to say, well, we've just decided this, but now you're telling us that. I mean, I understand why you want movement in there, and I think it's a scientifically sensible thing, but whether this is the right time to do it, I'm less certain of.
I see. Yeah, I agree with you. That maybe we can, I mean, I suppose that's going to be something we should put in our recommendations, as maybe how to go forward here.
I would certainly appreciate that.
I think the SRB, this is Kim, Alan. So there has been a push and for the Secretariat to really embrace the idea of how the biological and ecosystem research agenda affects the stock assessment in the MSE. And I think that there has been a concerted effort to do that really institutionalized in the last two SRB meetings in the work that, in the diagrams and the appendices Joseph has put together, and I'm sure your group, Ian's group, was working very closely with them. But I'm hearing you say we don't really understand how to move forward with something like migration or distribution or maybe even growth and reproduction. And so if there is this integration that's being embraced in one direction, I guess I'm a bit confused how your group or the stock assessment doesn't have a clearer vision of this, applied hypothesis test with the data that's coming in.
Yeah, I think we'll discuss some of that in the 5-year research plan, but I certainly don't want to make it seem like I'm throwing my hands up in the air here. What we have been doing really behind the scenes is, working with the research group and the knowledge that they have and the literature, and trying to come up with these hypotheses. What are the hypotheses that we currently can say about the Pacific halibut stock, and what are the hypotheses that we know we can reject? So much time has been spent on the MSE and just developing this framework that now is the time, now is the time to either do the simulations to supply results to the commission to make a decision on a management procedure, or to do further investigation and come up with a very robust set of operating models that can be used to evaluate. And that's the conundrum that we're sort of in right now is we have to get these simulations done. What Sven and Sean were talking about, we need to put something in place, but also, and then while we're doing that, we're trying to continue to work with the research team to make sure the research they are doing will then inform these operating models in the future. So we have an idea how to move forward, but we still have gaps in knowledge that we're trying to fill in, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good summary of the situation, as Alan put it. And yeah, I think this might it might be worth going back to some previous SRB recommendations and things like that, just to maybe remind the MSAB what our advice has been all along, and basically getting to the point to say, like, we're almost there. We're almost what we had asked for 4 years ago or something. Let's not get distracted. You know, the world is full of hypotheses, and they're going to keep coming. And you get a new one, then you're going to have to get another one. But that'll all be assessed and evaluated in due course. You know, that in the meantime, you know, let's get something in place while it's there. So, okay, let's take our break. So we'll come back at 11, 15 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Excellent discussion as always.
So Alan, was that the end? Yeah, that was the end of your presentation, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, well, fine. Okay. So today is the day that Dr. Olaf has to leave at 3:30. We might even get a chance to do a bit of drafting before then.
I have to.
3, it's even earlier. Okay. That might be harder. No, that's fine. But, yeah. Are you teaching in person or online?
Wow.
And is everyone masked up in the class, or?
We're in one of those states where we're not allowed to ask.
Admit that there's a pandemic raging.
Exactly. Yeah, we're supposed to pretend it's all normal.
Well, those are same here. Although I'm not teaching, but Sven, are you back? I notice you're muted in case you're trying to talk. Oh, there you go. Okay, great. Then we are on to the biological and ecosystem sciences section of the agenda. So I suppose, Joseph?
Yeah, thanks. If the
Take it away.
secretary can bring up the presentation. All right, great, thanks. Yeah, this I'm going to present the report on the biological and system science research activities. What I'll do is I'll start with the SRB recommendations and requests from SRB 18. And I'll start with the first set of recommendations in the area of reproduction. You had 4 specific requests. I'll move on to the first one, which is the request that the IPHC Secretariat focus
future reproductive biology studies on the development of an updated regulatory area-specific maturity archives. That is, schedules of percent maturity by age. And I'll let Tim Lohr speak to the plans for sampling for maturity coming up in the 2022 FIS. So go ahead, Tim.
Morning, everyone. You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So as Josep indicated, in 2022, beginning next year, and then moving into the future from there, we're going to start sampling for production of histologically based maturity schedules. I will simply note that Alan has pointed out that we should get away from the use of the word ogive, since that is strictly a cumulative distribution function, and we may find in the future that sort of effective maturity declines with age if there's skip spawning and so forth, and senescence related issues. So I'm going to go with maturity schedules, as Ian uses that a lot, and I think that's a pretty good term to use here. So we're going to need to produce a bunch of samples to do that, presumably by bioregion. We have some indication that maturity schedules may vary by region and vary over time. The graphic I'm showing you here, I should just point out, is simply data that are pooled from 2018 to 2020. So they're not strictly schedules that are sort of reliable and that Ian or Alan would use in any of their analyses. They're not adjusted, for example, for variable sampling rates among areas in those 3 years, but they do show that we have a potential for those maturity schedules to vary by bioregion, and so we'll need to construct robust schedules by region to evaluate that. If the literature can be any guide to us, we suspect that we'll probably need somewhere between 150 and 500 samples by bioregion. Some of the species listed in the literature are more relevant to halibut than others. In particular, it's going to depend a lot on sort of the relative age range of the maturity schedules and size range if we do maturity at length relative to the species that are listed. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to do some modeling exercises and some sensitivity analyses on sample sizes that look at variability over time and variability in space to see what is sort of our minimum sample size to produce robust maturity schedules that appear to be stable as sample sizes increase. Specifically, we'll want to target sample sizes around the 50% age and length of maturity, which is sort of our target estimation, as well as the primary slope that defines movement from low maturity to high maturity rates. And we're going to need to be particularly cognizant also of what sort of burden that puts on the FIS. The table at the bottom is just sort of an example of how this functionally gets implemented. Ultimately, we're looking to produce sampling rates on the FIS that will be loaded into the survey tablets that the onboard samplers use to determine which fish are within the random sampling protocol and which are not. And as you can see, sort of at the bottom, I've highlighted in yellow, should we determine, for instance, from modeling exercises that we ideally want 500 fish, there may be situations, for instance, out in Area 4B, especially in a year like next year where we may not sample the entire region, where we're not even going to catch 500 fish. So it might be a situation where we need to sample over a number of years in order to construct those and then account for the fact that the age classes progress through the population and that we've got sort of a moving target with cohort progression. There may also be situations logistically on survey where even target sampling rates that are below 100% are just too much burden for them to handle. So we'll need to have those discussions with the survey group. In short, the reason we haven't begun any of those modeling exercises yet is because of the movement of cohorts through the population. Sort of our most informative data, or at least important informative data, are the 2021 survey data, which we don't have available to us yet, but we expect to have them fairly soon, have them fully QA/QC'd and all the ages associated with it, and then we'll begin that modeling. And I will simply say that in 2023, we intend to start generating data for fecundity. The primary difference there is that for maturity sampling, we can probably get away with small excised sections of the ovaries that can then be subjected to histology. If we start looking at relationships between fecundity and size, fecundity and age, essentially looking for whether or not fecundity is truly allometric to size and age or is potentially hyperallometric, as has been seen in other species, we'll need whole ovaries. We would love to collect whole ovaries this year as well, and that would produce data for the fecundity analysis in the future in addition to the simple maturity sampling. But that again will be a matter of survey burden and whether or not they can handle us taking that many full ovary samples, big bottles, and lots of form and so forth. So that's where that stands at the moment. Sure. Yeah. Again, not for these data for sure. I don't know whether or not Ian and Alan have looked at any of the data that would have been treated in a more robust manner. Again, this was simple pooling just to make a point. I suspect that their answer, and Alan and Ian can jump in, is that we not want to do that, that we'd want to do that on an annual basis, and then maybe look back at how stable that is over time. If Ian and Alan want to jump in?
Evaluate the interannual variability before we would suggest pooling or not pooling over time, I think.
Well, yeah, I
And
mean,
mostly for
but
this
that's something you
diagram.
could test as a hypothesis in the logistic regression, right? Whether there's a Euro effect if you included the data together.
Yeah,
Should
exactly.
be, yeah.
The key here is that what we're looking at is a naive pooling of the visual maturity estimates, and we're not.
I see. Great. I missed that point. Thanks.
Yeah. And frankly, for this presentation, the primary reason I did that is because we didn't have every region fully sampled in each year. So I just wanted to be able to produce a maturity schedules that looked reasonable and didn't have stutters and gaps.
And my other question then was about the sampling and whether you're targeting particular sizes for that. Because obviously the region.
Yeah, exactly. That. Yeah, if you can clarify what his questions are, I can deal with those as well. Yeah, so that's essentially the point of the table below. I had some more like complex tables. We won't actually be actively targeting sizes, and we won't know the ages on survey, but that will be essentially the foundation of the analysis of what random sampling rate would we need to produce data that will then fill in those sizes and ages that will be around the inflection and around the slope. So it's an indirect process, but yes, it's an explicit goal of the modeling exercise. And then it just becomes a matter of setting the sampling rates high enough on survey that eventually generate those data.
Great. Yeah, I think it's worth being careful about any non-random sampling.
Yeah. Exactly. Yep. And in the background we did discuss the notion of size stratified sampling, and pretty much universally it was bad idea. Let's go with random, and attempts to get enough samples that if you really wanted to size stratify an analysis in the future, you could then subsample within the random samples that you've produced, but don't do it on the front end while you're on the vessel.
Yep. It's always tempting because it'll save you some time, but it'll cause some headaches later.
Right.
Great. Thanks, Tim.
But hopefully our negotiation with survey will just give us enough samples that we can post hoc do all that if need be, or if desired.
Well, yeah, and for your modeling, then it could be as simple as doing random subsetting of your data set to see, how low you can go while still getting consistent estimates.
Exactly. You can always drop out extra samples if you have them, but if you determine that you've produced a biased sample, then you're kind of hooped and have to go back to the drawing board.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Tim, I have another question.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, really exciting to see that you're moving forward with the expansion from one area where a lot of the data was collected to a multi-area perspective. I mean, I remember that one of the findings that you had is that if you were going to be using the FIS for sampling, it appeared that there was a window. There were a few months within the FIS that you were confident or more confident that you were getting data that would give you a pretty good idea of reproduction in the next year. So are you anticipating that that's going to be the target again this year, that same window of a subset of the FIS operational duration, or are you just going to be sampling throughout?
We'll be sampling throughout. In particular, Josep and or Teresa Fish's work that showed that they do have sort of determinate fecundity. It gives us a general feeling that we've got a robust ability to do a lot of this using the summer samples. Ideally, I mean, if there's an indication of skip spawning and we do have sort of a drift in time, our hope would be that with enough samples within the summer survey, we could actually identify what that window is that you speak of. I'm not terribly confident that we'll be able to do that sort of in year one. We'll probably have limited samples, but that is certainly an issue we'll need to look at in the future as we start to look into things like skip spawning, as Alan had implied.
Right. A follow-up question, if I could.
Yep.
So, certainly you're out there, you're collecting the data, all sorts of other opportunities to piggyback on other analyses, other questions, given that you have the data, even though it's not the primary goal of the work. I mean, is there any thought, or would it be possible to do any work about freezing the samples, that type of a thing, to look at measures of egg quality, vitamin levels, lipid levels, polar, non-polar lipids, other things like that, egg size, that would be metrics that would give you some idea of egg quality?
I mean, it would certainly be worth considering, and especially, as you say, if it's just a matter of freezing the samples and having the samples on hand that could be analyzed later. My sort of off-the-cuff impression, and survey team would have to step in on this, is that would likely be onerous for many of the vessels, but we may have some larger vessels with bigger freezer space that if freezing the samples does work, we could get a subsample that are frozen perhaps, and I think that's a good discussion to have with survey as we get onto the logistics of it, late winter, spring, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, even if you don't have the resources to analyze the data, collection of the samples is oftentimes, a big logistical hurdle. And if you have an opportunity, even keeping them frozen for some period of time until resources are available, it might be a really a nice add-on.
Yeah, absolutely. It's same as the post hoc data analysis. If you've got the samples, you can use them. If you didn't get them, then you can't.
Thank you.
A comment. Yeah. The comment. First of all, thank you very much. I do very much appreciate the efforts that have been made to actually figure out what you want out of this and how to go about it, and thinking about eventualities and possibilities and opportunities. It's definitely more than let's just go out there and see what we can see. So thank you very much for that.
Yep.
But one of the questions I guess I have is still around this hypothesis that you can't tell the maturity or the likelihood of spawning from the macroscopic analysis, right? That's why you're doing this.
Right. Correct. Yes.
And I'd like to see some sort of idea of how you're going to compare that. I mean, theoretically, you could compare that across bioregions to say, well, we're getting completely different results from the macroscopic. I'd just like to see some sort of analysis or some plan for how you're going to analyze that. so you can see whether it's what's the additional benefit of presumably the higher precision you get or the reduced bias you get from the histological sample, which is clearly more expensive.
Yeah, absolutely. That becomes a sort of the real crux of this, and it kind of fit into a presentation that was considered a little bit too long. But ultimately, that's what we'll need to do is we'll need to compare the histological to the morphological, and we'll get morphological data for all of these fish. That's sort of just a basic thing that's collected on every female. So as you say, if it turns out that the precisions or the accuracies from the histological don't really differ from the morphological, then you have to question whether or not all of the time and effort and money that's spent to do histological analysis is worth it. So that will definitely be incorporated. It just isn't in this slide, and that will again be a sort of a cost benefit analysis on the back end, but will presumably fit the same maturity schedules to the morphological as well. And then Ian and Alan can look at sort of which is more robust and what are the sort of, what do you gain and lose by using the two different techniques.
Yeah, I mean that's what I wanted to hear. So thank you very much. But I think
Absolutely.
What you need to actually do is look at some of this data preliminarily, because you're looking at collecting over multiple years, aren't you?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah. I would imagine
Yeah.
it'll take us at least 3 years, especially when we start working in the fecundity type data. So and especially if there's a change in time, you won't catch it unless you monitor it for a while.
Yes, but that's then a different issue. But I mean, you may have enough samples to give you some idea of how good you are. Your macroscopic evaluation is after the first year.
Correct.
And that can then determine how you spend the rest of the money and how you proceed. So I just want to make sure that that's part of the plan.
Yeah, and that evaluation, I'm sure, will happen on an annual basis at the end of next year when we see the data. There'll be an assessment and evaluation of whether or not it seems worthwhile to continue or increase sample sizes or maintain the same sampling protocol.
Yeah, I think you don't have to have a long explanation, but just a note in the presentation might have been helpful to actually say that you're going to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions, I'll move on. Thanks, Tim. The next request was that the IPHC Secretariat provide information on the age distribution of all females collected to characterize reproductive development throughout the annual cycle in order to refine efforts to identify potential skip spawning females. Here we provide the age distribution of those 342 females that were collected in the study intended to provide information on the seasonal characteristics of reproductive development in female Pacific halibut. You can see that the females, the 8 females that we found that were reproductively delayed during the months of November and December, when most females are actually already getting ready for spawning, are relatively few, and the ages range from 10 to 15 years old. Those 8 females, they're all actually large females, because if you remember, those females were selected based on size. We only collected females that were at least 90 centimeters long. So all these females are at least 90 to 100 centimeters in length. In weight, they average about 13 kilograms. So they're actually large females. What we don't know, and that is something that I pointed out in the report, in the written report for this meeting, is that we don't have enough information to determine whether these are true skip spawners, meaning that these are females that have previously spawned in previous years and they are skipping this year, or whether they're females that are immature females going through puberty, entering the first reproductive cycle and arresting. There's evidence for other species. So that's why we're actually very cautious in calling skip spawning females to this ones that show reproductive delays. We need a much larger sample size, and hopefully the study that is being designed for sample collection in next year in 2022 will provide us hopefully more information on what are the rates of true skip spawning in females. At this point, we're not confident enough to call these skip spawners. They're reproductive delayed females, and there's a small number of them.
Joseph, okay. All right, Sven. Yeah, thanks for explaining this figure. It was figure 1 under section 2.2.4 in the briefing documents. In SRB 18.8, you had 8 out of 180, and here you have a slide where you have 160 more females. Where did these females come from? I mean, the 180 were from a single location. Is this larger sample size where, again, it was just 8 animals, but out of basically double the sample size? Are they from the same area? Are they from multiple areas?
No, these are all from the same area. I mean, this was to respond specifically to the request from the SRB to show the age distribution of all females. As you remember, we collected females over 12 consecutive months. We targeted 30 females per month. So we had close to 360 females, of which several could not be aged because the otolith was either lost or crystallized. So we have ages for 342. Those are the females that you see here. The ones that I indicated in the report, those 180 females, are the ones that are within what we call the sexual or sexually capable reproductive phase. So those are females that are at least from mid-phytologenic growth, mid-secondary growth, until final oocyte maturation. So those are females that are clearly going through the maturation process and most likely will spawn. So that's the difference in numbers. What you see here is all females. That's what the request from the SRB 18 was, 342. The information that was detailed in the report was that these females are obviously the ones that are reproductively delayed, obviously happen during the the sexually capable phase. I hope that clarifies that.
No, thanks for that clarification. Is the work that Tim described, would it be possible to use those data for a different, both 2 time periods, 2 years for this area in question, but also across regions?
Unfortunately, we don't have data from other regions. We've only been targeting the Portlock area, but what we have data for, but has not been analyzed yet, so I cannot provide you with any results yet, is that we've been collecting ovarian samples from this particular region in the month of June, between June and July, for four consecutive years, in order to see if there's any temporal difference. But again, as I said, we have not fully analyzed those data to see any temporal changes. So that is something that we'll be able to address, possible temporal changes in the maturity of these females, but the spatial aspect will be done for the first time next year when we target sampling fish in different biological regions.
Thank you.
I guess I was one of the people who requested this figure to be clear in my mind what's going on, and to me it still shows that irrespective of whether they have spawned before, it's in that mixed maturity ages 10 to 15, where you have identified potential skip spawners. Is that correct?
That would be correct. The only clarification that I would add is that I'm a little hesitant to call them skip spawning because
No, that's fine.
yeah, but no, your statement is correct. Yes.
Yeah, so I would say that the chances of what one generally considers skip spawning is that way after maturity, there is a large number of individuals or sizable proportion of the population that doesn't spawn some years. That's not supported by the 15, 16, 17 and 18 year olds. Sorry, 16, 17 and 18 year olds. And the other element, is just probably consistent with a maturity ogive in this case, because they're not going all the way out to where they might see senescence. I still find it hard that this is going to have any major impact on the stock assessment. The maturity, you might have a slightly different maturity schedule, but as long as you estimate that, I don't think skip spawning is really a major issue in this stock assessment.
Yeah, thank you, Sven, for this comment. I think I would tend to agree. I think that with the available data, there's very little indication that there could be skip spawning. But again, next year with the collection of a much larger number of samples, we may have a better idea whether this is consistent or not. But I would agree with the point that you make that if there's any, it's a small percentage.
Yeah, and it's wise to have a look at another year in some ways, because this could have been an unusual year where the conditions were right for all of them.
And they could all be basically immature.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
If there's no more questions, I'll move on. The next request was regarding fecundity. I'm not going to read the entire request, but the SRB at the last meeting in June requested that we provide plans for investigating fecundity. Tim Lohr had just made a mention on our plans to start collecting those samples for fecundity assessment in 2023. But as a summary of what was presented in SRB019, the objective, as Tim already indicated, is to establish a fecundity size relationship. We have collected, in fact, in this setlines, Fisheries Independent Setline Survey, whole ovaries from 3 females that we will use late this fall or early next year to start testing several methods for fecundity assessment. Once we see the results, then we're going to select the most suitable method, hopefully by mid-2022, and that's the method that we're actually going to be implementing in the samples that will be collected during FIS 2023. So this is the plan moving forward regarding fecundity. The last Yeah, thank you, Olaf, for this comment. We'll make a note of it. Thank you. Right. This is a two-tier. Right. This is a two-tier project. So this considerations are actually coming up next, but we don't have them at this time. We focused this next year's efforts on maturity assessment, and next year in SRB 20 we'll be presenting our plans for sample collection and the sampling design for the fecundity analysis that will be conducted the following year in 2023.
Is there a reason why you are waiting with that? Is it just resource? Are you not having the time to do it?
Yeah, this is a good point. I think I think it boils down to a logistical concern regarding the collection of samples next year for both maturity and fecundity. I think we're not able to do the collection of both types of samples in 1 year. We have to separate it in 2 different years. So 2022, we'll be collecting samples for the histological based maturity schedules. And in 2023, then we'll collect the samples for the fecundity assessment.
Yeah, and Tim noted that, but that doesn't mean you can't look at a design at this point. You know, what you need. That way you can use this year's data to see if you can even get it. You know, looking at length frequency distributions, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, one way or the other, the comment hasn't really addressed the recommendation. So I guess we'll just have to keep it in and then see what happens at the next SRB. Is that right?
Well, this plan is in the way, but it was not ready to be presented here at the SRB 19. Yes, you could. In fact, you could collect whole ovaries, fix them in preservative, bring them back to the lab, and then excise a little piece for histology. But the logistics of it are complicated this time. I think there's a couple of issues that we need to figure out first, and that is whether we need to collect both lobes of the ovary. That's why we collected those ovaries this year for testing, not only the methods, but only whether we could just collect one of the 2 lobes. We need to determine whether there's any difference in egg production between the 2 lobes. If we can get away with collecting 1 lobe, then the container that we need to preserve it, or it's a lot easier for the collection. So there are a few considerations that prompted us to not collect the whole ovaries in the first year before we could actually test whether the number of eggs present in both lobes is equivalent. If it's not, then we definitely need to account for that.
Okay, thanks.
At least I think we can get a reasonable estimation of the egg contribution between lobes with the 3 females that we collected. Yes, they're all from the same stage.
Yeah, not to push this much more, Joseph, but I think what's happening is we're having trouble like understanding what the bottleneck is for doing more sampling. Is it just that the vessels can't carry that many?
Yeah, Yeah, the logistics are different for collection of ovarian samples. Ovarian samples, we're actually asking our SedLine specialists to collect probably like a 1 cubic centimeter sample of the ovary. What the process involves excising the ovary from the female, scoring the maturity macroscopically, slicing the ovary in half just to double check whether the appearance of the inside of the ovary corresponds to the different 4 types of maturity categories that they have, and then collect that 1 centimeter of ovarian tissue that then is placed into a 15 mil conical tube with 10 mils of formalin. So the footprint of the sample collection is relatively small. That can be done easily with a large number of samples. Now, if we were to do the same for each female for the entire ovary, we would have to use a 1 liter Nalgene plastic container with at least 500 mils of formalin. It's a lot more formalin to carry on the vessel. It takes a lot more space for those samples to be stored, collected, shipped back to the office. It's a much larger endeavor to collect ovaries for fecundity assessment alone. So that's why we staggered this ovarian sample collection in 2 years. First, maturity with a small piece of gonad that is in a small tube, and in year 2, which is FIS 2023, the collection of a larger footprint in terms of the space that those samples take in the vessel. So that is a consideration.
I think also to consider is the fact that these are food fish, and that's essentially a food preparation area where they're working. And those large, I mean, in the UK, it's not allowed to carry formalin on fishing vessels without, all sorts of risk assessments, etc., etc. So I'd imagine that there is going to be some resistance to all this formalin from the fishermen. So that's something that needs to be explored as well.
Yes, thank you. I'm not sure if Kim has a question.
No.
Okay. If there are no further questions, I'll move on. The last request regarding reproduction was that the analysis of the seasonal patterns in gonad development be explicitly tied to the development or improvement of the maturity oogyne. So this is what we show in this next slide, in which we show sort of the streamlined activities related to the seasonal characterization of reproductive development in order to provide an indication of why this work was essential for undertaking the studies that we're discussing right now. So first we started with the annual collection of samples in the central Gulf of Alaska in one region only, that's the Portlock region. We collected those samples to conduct a histological assessment of oocyte stages. Please note that there was no indication on oocyte stages in Pacific halibut prior to the study. We basically started from not knowing anything about ovarian development histologically. So the next step was to characterize the oocyte stages histologically. This classification led to the classification of females according to developmental stage. So what I mean here is females classified as primary growth, secondary growth, oocyte maturation, spawning, post-spawning. And then that would lead us to the classification of females according to their reproductive phases. And those are the ones used in stock assessment. immature, spawning capable, regressing, and regenerating. And those are the four reproductive phases that are typically used. So from this study, I would say that the main research outcomes were key parameters, information on key parameters of the reproductive biology of the species that were not known before. First, that this is a species with a group synchronous reproductive development, that they're batch spawners. There was some indication prior to that. Importantly, that this species has determinate fecundity, and more importantly, that this species undergoes an annual reproductive cycle. The spawning time, at least in the central Gulf of Alaska, was identified to take place in January and February, so it was a pretty defined period of time during the year. And we identified a few fish with reproductive delays. Possibly, in terms of the practical continuation of these studies, was that we determined that the appropriate time of gonad collection within the fish was, in fact, the months of July and August, and that's where you would identify fish already in the spawning capable fish phase, meaning the fish that you would collect during that time. If they were not immature, then those fish would most likely undergo full reproductive development, leading to final oocyte maturation and spawning. So those are the studies that we designed and we executed prior to the histologically based maturity ogives or schedules that we just discussed, and the fecundity assessment. This work, in fact, generated one publication already out in the Journal of Fish Biology in 2020, and there's another publication that is coming up fairly soon for submission to a peer-reviewed journal regarding the seasonal characterization of reproductive development. And in this study, Teresa Fish, who's a master's candidate from Alaska Pacific University, funded by the IPHC, was the main person behind doing the work. Also, this work that we've already conducted, as you can see here, is crucial for the comparison of the macroscopic or visual versus the microscopic maturity staging, which has been discussed just a few minutes ago, and it will be crucial to determine whether the current field maturity classification criteria is accurate, and then, if not, ways to revise it. So this is currently in progress, and hopefully we can have the information. We'll be able to have the information on this comparison after next year's collection of gonads. Other staff involved in this project, that's obviously Tim, Alan, Ian, and myself. Correct. We collected close to 360 females, for which we have both the histologically based maturity and maturity stage, developmental stage, reproductive phase, and we also have the macroscopic maturity classification. So we can actually do that, and that's something that we've been waiting to do because we haven't had really the time. So after the characterization of the seasonal reproductive development, which is a study that is almost complete, and as I said, it's being written now for publication, the next step is to go to those samples in particular and establish a first comparison between macro and microscopic with the set of samples that we have already. That's in the pipeline.
And that has the potential to then affect your 2022 to 2026 plan, which you're now putting in already, right? So shouldn't this be a priority to do before you put that plan in? Because it can dramatically change what you should be doing in 22.
Yes, I guess it's kind of hard to say without having it done, but considering that this is with a relatively small number of samples, and we have the capability of doing it with a much larger collection of samples from next year. I honestly don't see how this will dramatically affect the plans moving forward after 2022. It will complement, it will guide us a little bit, but I don't think it will dramatically affect it.
I had, I guess, a question for Ian or Alan on this. So earlier, we asked Ray whether or not, taking in consideration marine mammal depredation was really important in the work, and his answer was, well, in one area it is, or above some level it is, and this level of skip spawning, so whether it's 8 out of 180, which is what was reported before, or maybe it's 8 out of 342 based on the additional data that that Joseph presented. I'm just curious. I mean, that's 4.4% of females don't reproduce in a given year, and I would argue that 6 of the age classes of the older females you had, well, 4 of them you had 1 fish, right? And 2 other, in 6 of the age classes you had less than 10 individuals, and so it's probably not a very good estimate given the small sample size. So is 4.4%, is that not worth including in the stock assessment or the MSC?
Yeah, this is Ian. I can definitely answer that. 4.4% is not going to have a large effect if that's just a base rate and every year it's always about 4% and nothing changes over time, because that's going to be it's going to translate into a scalar to the stock recruit function, which is already being estimated to some degree within the stock assessment model. However, what we've identified through sensitivity analyses using the assessment specifically is that if these sorts of things trend over time, then that can have an effect on our current biomass estimates and therefore our current status estimates. And so I think the key is that this current plan of research is really a stepping stone to get us to the point where we have the tools and the understanding to create a long-term monitoring plan that can monitor maturity and fecundity over time as it potentially changes under climate change and stock distribution changes and other things. So although we might not see a delta currently in the stock assessment, there's definitely a potential that it could become important in the future.
And this is Alan. Related to the MSC, I've set up some simulations investigating if we have the maturity curve incorrect in the stock assessment and reality, it is different, like it's shifted to the left, shifted to the right, or has skip spawning. And I've done some pilot simulations in the MSC just to make sure it's working. But unfortunately, I haven't finished those simulations in time for this meeting. I'll be sharing those with the research group probably within the next few weeks to begin to, as a process to begin to understand the sort of the effects, I think is what you're getting at, of different specifications of maturity on the outcomes of the MSC as well as on the effects on the assessment.
Thank you.
Kim, just for clarification, I guess to my mind they are included in the stock assessment, as immature fish because they're fish that are not spawning. So in terms of the estimate of SSB, it's not here trying to make sure that it is actual skip spawning versus immaturity, I guess is what I'm saying, doesn't make a difference. Just because I think that was the confusion that you had. It will be accounted for, it's just not specifically as skip spawning.
This is Ian. I agree with you, Sven. However, the caveat would be that, as Kim pointed out, we don't have a lot of information on the oldest fish yet. And so if this is something that actually affects all of the mature females and not just the ones that are around the age of maturity, then it would function somewhat differently in its effect on the assessment. But at this point,
that was
we don't
exactly
know.
Yeah, that was exactly why we had the request to see the whole population and ask the question, why was it that and why was it not a wider one? But looking at those, I think part of the problem may be that there isn't enough old fish or older fish in the population, or at least not in the fifth sampling, for you to be able to answer that question.
Joseph, you might have mentioned this before in other presentations and I forgot, but was there any evidence that any of the females were atritic?
Yes, yeah. Most of these females actually show some evidence of atresia. Almost all of the 8 females that were reproductively delayed. But that would be compatible with let's say, an immature female that starts the first reproductive cycle earlier in the year and then arrests. And those ovarian follicles would then be degenerating and reabsorbing. And then by the time those samples were analyzed in December or November, mostly in December, then those atritic follicles would be quite evident. So that is true. Most of those females actually showed atritic follicles. That is one of the characteristics also of skip spawning fish. But unfortunately, in December, since the previous spawning period would have finished in February, no later than that, it's really almost impossible to determine whether there's any post-ovulatory follicles, and that's one of the key features of identifying skip spawners. You definitely want to demonstrate that female has spawned previously, and for none of those females we could actually see post-ovulatory follicles. They may have been there in that 14-year-old female, for instance, if it had spawned previously, but it was so long after the spawning timing that those post-ovulatory follicles would probably look very much like a degenerating or atritic follicle. It's very hard to tell. And atresia is a complicated subject, as you all know. There's several types of atresia, but so late in the process, very hard to tell. But they all had atritic follicles.
Thank you.
If there's no more questions, I'll move on to the next request. So we're moving now to the research area on growth, and the request from the SRB was that the Secretariat explicitly describe how gene regions identified as over or underexpressed would be used. There was several specific requests regarding the expression of those genes that show differential expression in the studies that were conducted previously. And there was a call for further investigation. This request originates from the study that was completed and reported to the SRB in the last few meetings, and that's a study that was conducted by growth manipulations induced by either temperature or other types of manipulations. Most of the results that were presented to the SRB were regarding temperature, and we presented the results on a number of genes and proteins that show differential expression and abundance in response to changes of growth induced by the temperature manipulations, and from which a number of potential growth markers were identified. So the step that we actually conducted, and we provided some results in the supplementary documentation for this meeting, was that we looked at the expression of some of those growth markers identified in that previous study in samples collected in the wild from fish that were collected in the NIMS-TRAL survey that corresponded to different sizes of the same age. So what we did was to choose an age for which we could actually find a broad distribution of sizes, and we were able to select age 4, so 4-year-old fish from sizes ranging from 30 to 61 centimeters, and we had 3 size bins, and we tested the hypothesis of whether those markers that we identified in the previous study could actually detect differences in expression that would correspond to the different sizes, and hopefully representing those different sizes, hopefully representing different growth rates. So the results that we provided, and here I'm just showing it I'm just showing you on the far right the expression levels of one of those genes that successfully identified growth differences in those fish collected in the NIMS-TRAL survey. That's myosin heavy chain, a well-known structural element in skeletal muscle that its expression mimics the growth rate of the individuals. And there were several other markers that showed significant changes in relation to size. So those are potential molecular markers that could be used to identify the growth rate of the individuals.
Yeah, that was really interesting that the data from wild-caught fish, really supported the experimental findings, even though those fish were, the fish that used for the experiments were captured from a specific area. They were a specific age, and they were subjected to, just a specific set of environmental circumstances. So taking it on there like that was interesting. I guess one question I had is, so you mentioned in the supplemental materials that I think you had 10 genes which were differentially over and underexpressed. And I don't remember if you defined what those were, but let's say for sake of argument that you develop an assay, and it's a qPCR assay, and you have 20 genes, and you're going to develop a vector for each individual fish from an area, from a time, of a certain age, whatever. And the data that you're going to be providing is a vector of expression levels or relative expression levels, and it's going to be 20 values. So could you articulate how you would interpret that information, and then how Ian's going to be using that information?
Yeah, I guess we would, obviously the beauty of these studies is that there are a number of markers that have been identified that their expression mimics the direction of growth. So we can actually use those potentially to determine whether a particular fish is in real time in a positive or in a negative growth trajectory. So we could inform whether growth is being promoted or not promoted in fish that are collected at the time of sampling. So this does not reflect prior growth patterns. This reflects information on the growth pattern at the time of sampling. So that's I think at least for now, this gene expression data would probably inform on growth patterns at the time of sampling.
But how does that affect the stock assessment? Are you making the assumption of, maybe there are some critical ages out there where you would be making some sort of inferences that affects time to maturity or something like that, that would be really important in the stock assessment, or how does Ian use that information?
Well, I think this is something that needs to be developed a lot further for direct input into the stock assessment. I mean, this is, and I would like to call this preliminary work that will allow us to establish possible relationships between growth and sex, between growth and maturity. I think there's still quite a bit of work to be done linking those growth markers with other processes in order to be used in stock assessment. But we can at least provide information on the direction of growth at the time of sampling. And I think the results that we've presented here are indicative of that. Further extractions of information, that is something that we need to continue working on.
Yeah, this is Ian. I'd like to highlight that Josep really touched on the important aspect there. In the current stock assessment, we treat size at age as a completely empirical process. So we use direct observation to inform the years where we have data. What we're lacking is a mechanistic understanding. And so where that causes us problems is in piecing together missing data in the historical time series, as well as making forecasts and projections. And in those two cases, without a mechanistic understanding of the factors that are actually involved, all we can do is represent the variability. As we start to understand which factors are influencing growth, we can actually build those processes in, be it diet or density dependence or temperature or fishing or other things. And that will both improve our reconstruction of the historical time series where we're missing data, but it will also improve our short-term forecasts. And of course, perhaps even more important in moving into structuring the operating models and the hypotheses explored in the MSE.
Right. No, I see that, but I mean, you could have differential expression levels due to a variety of different factors. And I think there was one more request that the SRB has that Josep is going to or has yet to answer. But yeah, which is exactly that point. What is the mechanism behind this? So, but I mean, it's exciting in some ways, but it's really difficult. I mean, a lot of these studies, gene expression studies, have been done in the lab, right? And a lot of it's been done with linear modeling, linear mixed modeling, typically, where oftentimes you have a treatment variable which could be a fixed effect, and you had random effects, typically of individuals of the same family or the same stock or something like that, right? So very regimented. When you're taking things out into the natural environment, there's so much variability associated with variables that are unmeasured. Often it can be difficult to understand mechanisms. So I guess I would just encourage you to be collecting whatever information that might be possible that could be used to explain or understand mechanisms behind these transcriptional changes or differences.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. The point is well taken, and I do acknowledge that part of the request was to provide a mechanistic explanation. I mean, we don't have any really empirical data to try to explain the nature of the changes in mRNA level expressions. Here, what you're measuring is the levels of mRNA for a particular gene in relation to genes that we call housekeeping genes that do not change with respect to treatment. Just, kind of an ideal situation. But
Sure.
of course, we don't have the capabilities right now to explore other possibilities of regulation. And one that has been suggested for growth is the methylation of specific growth-related genes. And in other flatfish species, and I think if I'm remembering correctly, there were several studies with the Senegalese sole, which is a related flatfish species, on the methylation pattern of the myogenin promoter. Myogenin is a key factor that is involved in somatic growth, and a temperature during the juvenile stages affects the methylation of the promoter, so that later on in adulthood, in fact, that promoter is permanently turned off or on with respect to the temperature at which those juveniles were raised, and that influences growth later on. So there are a number of possibilities, and I think you pointed to a really good direction for future studies. Those at the moment we don't have the capabilities of right now.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, there was a second request regarding the area of growth, and that is that the Secretariat use the gene regions of those genes that were identified in the previous study and align those sequences to the whole genome sequence data. The request was regarding the identification of sequence variability within the coding regions or regulatory regions of those genes, and we've looked at that just very recently, and in fact we have mapped, as you can see in this table, we have mapped 10 of those genes that show differential expression at the mRNA level to the genome, and asked the question of whether they have SNPs associated with coding or non-coding regions. And here you can see the example of 10 of those genes. I think the most important thing to say here is that right now efforts are invested into characterizing the SNPs presence in the coding sequence and in upstream regulatory regions. We chose a 5 kb region upstream of the transcription start site for all those genes, and that we're continuing characterizing those SNPs. Basically, where they fall, whether in the regulatory regions, whether those SNPs fall in the locations where transcription factors are regulating potentially regulating the expression of that gene, or within the coding sequence, causing even alterations in the translated protein. So what I can say also is that now, as a result of this exercise that was recent, that now we have a pipeline, a bioinformatic pipeline to interrogate those SNPs in and around those gene regions, and hopefully once we build up that data set, then we can start looking into the potential other potential avenues. And I think Kim, you were referring to how we could use this in other genomic studies, and I think those are feasible within the types of studies that Andy will describe later on, with individual low coverage whole genome resequencing for individuals that are used right now to ask questions regarding population structure, but could be used for other means. So as a summary, what we've done is at least within this first 5-year research plan, we've identified and validated a number of physiological markers through a series of growth laboratory experiments and validation studies using fish caught in the wild. And one of the outcomes is really information regarding physiological markers, growth and proteins that are differentially expressed, so putative growth markers, and then use those that are responsive to temperature in future studies that will address potential environmental influences on growth patterns. So this is one of the areas where research regarding climate change could play an important role. And also those validated markers for growth could be used also in future studies examining dietary influences on growth patterns and physiological condition. Again, most of this study that was completed recently, it was part of a MPRB grant that finished in mid last year, and we have a paper that is in preparation describing these results. And the staff that were involved were Andy Jasonowicz, Crystal Simchik, who's our new biological laboratory technician. Crystal has replaced Anna Simeon, who's gone to graduate school to pursue a PhD at the School of Aquatic and Fishery Sciences here at the UW. And Crystal is also involved now in other projects as well, and she has good expertise in laboratory techniques and particularly in molecular biology and genomic analysis. So she'll be crucial for us moving forward in a number of fronts. If there are no questions regarding this research area, if you allow me, I'll move on and I'll present the next research area. That's discard mortality rate and survival assessment, and I'll let Claude Dijkstra speak to it. Go ahead, Claude.
Hey, good afternoon. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. So thank you. I missed the last meeting. I was out in the field working on this actual particular project. This is an update on the guided recreational fishery discard mortality work. So this was preceded with an effort to collect information on typical handling practices within the fleet, as well as hook types and sizes that they were using. This effort was some field work following up on that, testing those main types of gears and looking at the types of capture conditions, size composition of those fish, what kind of injury levels they had, and what kind of stress levels of those fish we saw, as well as an assessment of the mortality of those discarded fish. So we did some work out of IPHC area 2C out of Sitka from 21 to 27 of May. And then I was in Seward during your last meeting from the 11th to the 17th of June. So let's see if I can move the slides here. The Sitka effort, in both of these areas, we fished 2 gear sizes, 12-aught hooks and 16-aught hooks. We had 6 rods fishing from each vessel, and then we sampled the fish, looking at fight time, time on deck. We took their weight, length. We looked at the injuries that each had and took a photo of that to back that up. We looked at the viability before they were back in the water. We collected fat content information, fish temperature, took a blood sample, took a fin clip so we could determine the sex. And then in Sitka, we wire tagged all the fish. We had a goal of trying to target 240 fish per site, and we reached that in the 7 days of fishing with a total of 243 on the Sitka charter. The Seward charter had a similar target of fish, but we did not encounter as many fish. We caught a total of 118. It was the same protocols on this one, other than we were wanting to get 80 of the satellite pop-up archival tags. These are the accelerometer tags. So we did get all 80 of those tags out, and an additional 38 fish were tagged with wire tags. Same sorts of information were collected, and those tags are actually actively reporting in right now after having been on the fish for a total of 96 days. I think that's back to you, Joseph. Yes, sure. That's correct. So we use the traditional NIMPS viability categories. So those are excellent, moderate, poor, and dead. And they take into account injuries to the fish, blood loss to the fish, things like that. And then the 80 fish that we tagged with the SPAT tags, those were all in excellent classification. And those are the ones that are then kind of used to estimate the subsequent categories based on traditional tag returns.
Excellent category from the satellite tags, an absolute estimate of survival there. And then that's used in terms of scaling the relative returns of the coded tags to get an absolute estimate for the other categories. Is that right?
Yes, that's the plan on how that data will be used.
Okay, great. And what are the proportions in the different condition categories?
I don't have that
roughly,
at my fingertips for this study, but roughly there was no dead fish on this study, and the vast majority were in excellent quality condition. There was a few moderates and 1 or 2 poors out of the 361 fish overall. But I believe it was like 85% were in excellent condition, and then majority of the rest were in moderate. There was only a couple that were in poor. No deads though.
Okay, great. Thanks. That makes sense. Sorry, Sven.
That is correct. They're current. Yeah. So the previously reported tags were on the long line effort. So traditionally, these sorts of DMRs have been predicated on kind of holding studies of fish, and these are the first 2 studies where we're actually trying to get ground truth data in the actual fisheries themselves. No problem. Joseph, I think we're back to you.
charters this year. This is a study that was funded both by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation as well as from the North Pacific Research Board. Just an update on the longline fishery study. We have now a paper reporting on the longline discard mortality rate estimations that is in review, the North American Journal of Fisheries Management. And in this study, in addition to Claude, Tim Lohr, Alan, Ian, and myself were involved. If there are no further questions, the last portion, and I think that will probably fill in the last 5 minutes. Yes. I think I'll let Claude answer that question. Claude, do you recall exactly?
I don't recall exactly the amount of time between discard and its mortality event. Tim may be able to speak to that one.
Tim, are you on?
Yeah, indeed. If I would have to check the numbers, but if I recall correctly, 46 days was our minimum time. We had them programmed out to 96, and the maximum was very close to 96. And then we had some 96-day pop-offs that we sort of talked around and debated whether or not those fish were dead. We don't actually believe they were. The key there was that delay in mortality is, as you have sort of implied, very different than what was seen in the experimental studies, where the experimental studies, the discard mortality was almost always within 2 to 3 weeks. And when we did our trawl discard mortality study earlier, same thing occurred. Almost all of that mortality was within 2 weeks. So for the longline discard mortality, it was substantially delayed. And then there's also the debate within the paper and within the group whether or not that was really discard mortality or might have actually just been natural mortality, because the rates and delays were not inconsistent with that hypothesis either.
Well, and I guess that was my my point. When you say the trawl studies, they were also based on the tag release, or they were based on keeping them in tanks?
They were wild tag release with the SPATs, yeah, and almost all of that mortality was inside 2 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some indications for things like swordfish or tarpon that the mortality is large, even though they swim off. But I've never heard of such long mortality. I mean, I find it very difficult to associate that with a particular event having no control group that hasn't been caught.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree with you, and that's where I sort of drift into, and it was Alan's original hypothesis that the mortality that we saw was not inconsistent with natural mortality rates and patterns. And I like you say, without a control group to look at it, it's difficult, if impossible, to state with certainty, but I tend to drift toward that notion that what we saw in the long line was closer to natural mortality than an event-based stress response.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
We have 5 slides left in the presentation. Sean, I'm not sure whether you would want us to continue, finish, or we just leave it after the lunch break. I believe we have a lunch break at 12:30, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, this should take about, presentation-wise.
We'll be ahead of schedule. So yeah, let's do it.
this should, at least the presentation size should take no more than 5 minutes. So the next is the genetics and genomics area, and I'll let Andy Jasonowicz speak to the results. So Andy, please go ahead.
Let's see, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so I'm going to be giving a brief update on where we are in terms of our work using low coverage whole genome resequencing to revise our understanding of genetic population structure in Pacific halibut in the northeastern Pacific Ocean, primarily focusing on that potential structure that might be that might exist in Area 4B. So here I have an update on the sequencing metrics that were presented at the last SRB meeting. And I guess important to note here is that we've completed the bioinformatic processing for an additional 250 samples. So bringing that total up to 285 out of the 600 samples that we have planned to sequence for this project. And so that enabled us to fill out some additional cells in this table here pertaining to the sequence data from these two different sequencing runs. So these are average numbers, and then in parentheses is the minimum and maximum numbers for each statistic. And so as far as these numbers are concerned, the two runs are very comparable in terms of their data output on a per sample basis. In particular, relating to the number of sequence reads pertained per sample, and then the average genomic coverage that we're seeing per sample. So really, this is kind of I guess proof that these library construction methods work, and we can successfully scale up the sequencing efforts to higher throughput sequencing platforms. So this is a flow chart of the workflow that's proposed for this project. And so when I say bioinformatic processing, what I'm really referring to is this portion over on the left, the sequence read alignment workflow, which really consists of aligning the actual raw sequence reads to the reference genome, performing some quality control steps, and then the SNP detection that follows. And so since the last meeting, we've been working closely with the technology services group to move this analysis to run on Microsoft Azure cloud services. And that's been great from a convenience perspective, and then a perspective in terms of I guess the time required for these computational steps. It's greatly reduced that. Being that we now have 200 a reasonable number of data for a reasonable number of samples, we've begun to explore some of the downstream analyses that we've proposed at previous meetings. So as far as some of the methods for the preliminary analyses that we've done so far are concerned, for SNP detection, we're using angst, and then some of the I guess some of the filtering parameters that we used are listed below. So we're using a global minor allele frequency cutoff of 0.01, a fairly stringent p-value for a site being variable or not, and then we're requiring sequence data for a given site to actually have sequence data in 214 out of 285 samples, which is about 75%. And so using those filtering parameters, we've identified about 2.5 million SNPs throughout the Pacific halibut genome. But we've have done additional sampling prior to any analyses of population structure. And so that includes removing any SNPs that are present in any unplaced scaffolds in the genome assembly, removing SNPs on chromosome 9 that contains a large region that's associated with sex, and then any SNPs that are in the mitochondrial genome prior to any analyses of population structure. So really restricting that to autosomal chromosomes. That left us with about 10 million SNPs. So still, very, very large number. And then our analyses, any analyses that we use that relied on principal components analysis, that's implemented in PC Angst, the software that we're using for that. And that implements a default minor allele frequency threshold of 0.05. And so for those analyses, we're only using about 4.8 million SNPs. So on this slide, I have the results of some preliminary analyses of population structure. So on the left is a multidimensional scaling plot that was derived from global estimates of our pairwise estimates of global FST. And we only estimated FST between populations or sample collections where we had at least 30 sequence data for 30 individuals. Those estimates of FST range between 0.0048 and 0.0073, which is, I guess, fairly typical for, marine species that have, similar life history characteristics as Pacific halibut. And then on the right is individuals plotted along the principal components analysis, or along the two principal components from our principal components analysis, and each point is colored by the geographic area that they were collected in. Being that we had so for some of these areas we have sample collections made across multiple years. I thought it'd be interesting to look at this according to not only geographic area but collection year as well. So the columns, are each a different collection area, and the rows are each a different collection year. And it, it's in particular, when you compare, say, like the sample collections between 2007 and 2020. It seems like there could be, an important temporal aspect to the, population genetic structure of the stock that's being captured by that first principal component, especially if you look at, say, the samples collected in the central elutions. These results are preliminary. We still have additional sample collections to add to this moving forward. And so I think, moving forward, the central Gulf of Alaska will be, particularly interesting to add to this because we have, sample collections spanning like a 19-year period between 1999 and 2018. Okay, so again, here we have some, preliminary results of some selection scans that we conducted using PC Angst. And that's, you can see the results of that in the Manhattan plot up top. And then down below are Manhattan plots derived from pairwise FST that was estimated in a sliding window fashion across the genome. And for this, we use 10 kilobase windows with a 5 kilobase step. Again, only using sample collections where we had at least 30 samples. And for this, we're using that entire data set of approximately 10 million SNPs. And so, so you can kind of see, in some of these, there's some of the regions of the genome are showing elevated levels of differentiation between these two, or between some of these populations. And so those may may be worth looking into to see if we can use the SNPs present in those regions to potentially identify the geographic origin of samples that may have not been collected during the spawning season. And so with that, I'll unless there's any questions, I'll hand it back to Josette. Sure.
locales. Could you remind us again what these were? These were putative spawning areas, or how were they delineated?
Yeah, correct. So so the sample collections that were made here, they're shown in this map here, and uh, these are all fin clips that were taken during trips that were made during the spawning season between say January and February. Yeah, if that, so yeah, these are all, assumed to be, collected, on the spawning grounds.
Okay, again, could you go back to that Manhattan plot?
Sure.
So you mentioned the criteria. So what were you using, say, to conduct an outlier analysis on these? So which maybe you could identify.
Right.
Outliers?
Yeah. So I mean, right. So this, doesn't explicitly I didn't apply, any threshold. These are just, kind of graphics produced, I guess, for the purposes of, data exploration, right? So yeah, we didn't actually apply any given threshold to this. So, I mean, I've seen the top kind of, maybe 10th percentile used before for, in particular like the FST analysis.
Yeah.
But yeah, we still have yet to actually set that threshold.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting. So in this pairwise comparison to see if you were, there were different putative SNPs or gene regions that were consistently across all pairwise comparisons as outliers, or whether or not there were some between certain regions. If there were between, pairs of regions, that would be really, really interesting and something to get into in terms of the Go terms and the gene annotation for those, or to use for, other analyses of population of origin of individuals if you had some, really, really strong differences in FST in these outliers.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah, we're, not quite there yet. And, as we start to add more samples, that's, we'll definitely be doing that. So.
Right, and then just another measure. I mean, you have so many SNPs is just the number or proportion of private alleles in these different areas would be also something that would be interesting to look at.
Sure, definitely. We can certainly do that.
Yeah. Okay. Nice stuff.
Yeah. Thanks.
So just moving to the last slide. This is again a summary slide for the research area. We want to highlight that the sequencing of the Pacific halibut genome at chromosome level assembly was key to conduct all the studies that Andy has described. So this has been important for guiding the development of methods for looking at population structure, for establishing that bioinformatic pipeline, and hopefully this will be leading to the establishment of baselines of genetic diversity, and finally the delineation of fine scale stock structure. That should be the first deliverable of this work. I just want to highlight as the last thing that we have a grant proposal to cover this and other aspects related to population genomics in an application, a grant application to the North Pacific Research Board that is now under consideration. And that brings our presentation to an end. Thanks.
Sure. So we're at 12:45. This is now our lunchtime. Let's see. Our lunch was scheduled to go till 1:30, and our economics was scheduled to begin at quite a ways after that. So I think, shall we take a 1 hour or an hour and 15 minutes for lunch? What do you guys think? Okay. Okay. So let's come back at 1:45 and we'll start off with the economics update. See you in an hour.
Thank you.
Ready to start whenever you are, Sean.
Yes.
Pacific Halbut impact on economies of United States and Canada. This study really intends to bring this human dimension to the IPHC's research framework, which should be considered an essential component of the optimal management of Pacific Halbut. So my plan for today is really to focus on the latest set of the results and ensure that there's you have a correct, right interpretation of these results. So I will just really shortly remind you on the basics of the economic impacts, noting the components that have been incorporated already before, as well as noting the components that have been added since the last SRB meeting. Then I will just give you a short reminder of the model setup. And then we'll go to those results I mentioned, and I will close with the just a short note of the economic impact visualization tool, and we'll go into final notes and conclusions with the recommendations for the SRB. So just a short note, let's start with the commercial sector. Primary inputs to production of Pacific Halbut is Pacific Halbut itself. The sector, however, also requires inputs for its production, and these will be coming from other industries. These industries, when supplying fishing vessels, will create the demand from other sectors. And at the same time, these industries will also create employment opportunities and generate profits. And these profits and earnings in form of wages will be, when spent locally, adding to the economic impact in each of the regions and have an important input to coastal communities' prosperity. And these business-to-business transactions, as well as inputs to households' incomes, these will be known as indirect and induced economic impacts. The changes in the Pacific halibut commercial sector will also have a direct impact on the industries that directly rely on the output from this sector, and this will be a processing sector. This processing sector will also demand inputs from other industries and will produce wages and profits, and these will have additional economic impact to economies of the countries of the United States and Canada. So these are the two sectors that I incorporate in the model, and I would note here that I do not incorporate the wholesale, retail, or services because the link to economic impact here is not that clear, just because there's a multitude of substitutes available at those further value chain levels or links. Similar effects will be attributed also to the recreational sectors. When running their businesses, the charter owners will create demand for inputs from other industries. They will also create employment opportunities and generate incomes. Those incomes earned earnings in form of wages. When these are spent, they also contribute to the economy. What is more, the anglers themselves will contribute to the economy when there is a demand from them for other inputs, and this will be related to their spendings on their fishing trips, but also lodging services or demand for equipment. So what I would note here is that the latest version of the model incorporates now all these sectors. Before, it was just the charter sector that was included in the final set of the results. However, I will caution here that the uncertainty how much Pacific halibut effort, how much of Pacific halibut effort is part of the total effort. So how much of the total recreational output is dependent on just Pacific halibut versus other species, or how much anglers could just shift to other species if the Pacific halibut was not available. The interlinked nature of all the industries in the economy is also creating cross-regional impacts, and all of these will be included now in the model. So the economic impacts generated by Pacific halibut, these can be retained in the area where resource is extracted, but then because of different types of flows that are observed, they can also